we are going to be talking about the 7 pillars of strategic accessibility today. And I am Enid. So to give you a visual description, I am a dark-skinned Black woman. I have what I consider a bright smile and rosy cheeks and deep Black lines. And I'm currently wearing long Black braids that are pinned back from my face. So you can clearly, my face is visually, is able to be viewed easily. And so to give you an idea, I am a senior manager of product accessibility at Riot Games. I have a master's in digital media design for learning from NYU and a bachelor's in electrical engineering from Georgia Tech. And I give you a bit of my background to kind of show you how I got into accessibility and how the things that I've worked on over my career have led me to this point. So I like what I consider the first third of my career in information technology, working with JB Consulting and with Accenture, and then moved on to education technology, working with Instructure and BrainPOP and Sesame Workshop. And now currently I work in gaming with Riot Games. And the idea that I want to convey here is that I've had a long career filled with all different types of technology across different sectors and different industries. And so my view on accessibility and experience in accessibility comes from working across those industries and not one specifically. So why do I do this work? I'm a woman, as I mentioned before. I'm Black and I'm an immigrant. And so what I've had to do in this, short life of mine so far is that I've had to survive and thrive and exist in spaces that were not created for me. When I started working in technology and in digital media and in gaming, what I realized is that I have a place of privilege and an opportunity to really serve a community that I, in this case, have the privilege of not having any known physical disabilities or no disabilities that I know of. And so I see this as an opportunity and a privilege to really make decisions and inform decisions and create technology and digital spaces and content and games that really serve the disabled community. And so at the core of everything I do and the work that I do on a day-to-day is really about giving back and helping that community and helping to make technology that serves them and creates an equitable experience for disabled users. So let's talk about the why. So in 2019 to 2020, the number of children and youth ages 3 to 21 receiving any sort of special ed services was about 7.3 million, which is about 14% of all public school students. And this number increases every year. So in 2022, it's about 16%. And this statistic comes from the National Center for Educational Statistics. When we move on to games, there are about 33 million gamers with disabilities in the US. And if we're aware of the US population, which is about 330 million, that's about 10% of the US population. And approximately 92% of those people with disabilities play video games. And so when we think about it, when we don't make games that are accessible, or we don't ensure that users with disabilities or players with disabilities are able to play our games, we're really missing out on a huge market of users or players who want to be able to access our games. These numbers come from the Accessibility Foundation. And the last one is that 26%, and that's about 1 in 4 of adults in the United States have some type of disability. And this number comes from the CDC, or Center for Disease Control. And so when we think about creating technology and content and digital spaces, it's very important in every type of industry. As I mentioned, I've worked in information technology, I've worked in educational technology, and I've worked in games. And the idea here is that creating accessible content is important in every single industry that we can think of. The disability is not the barrier in this case. What is the barrier is that we are not creating the technology and the content and the websites and the digital spaces that account for the different abilities of our users and of our players. And so until we do that, until we create programs that by extension then create that technology and software and spaces, then we are creating the barrier to access for users with disabilities. I always include this when I speak about why we need to do this work and why it's important. So on this slide, I have a picture of a red armchair, single sitter. I like to pick a comfortable chair. So when you think about this red chair, think about the most comfortable chair you've ever sat in. And let's envision that we walk into a room or we enter a room and this chair is sitting and there's a spotlight shining on the chair. And we just really want to sit in it because it looks very inviting and we know that it's comfortable. And so a voice says, you know, you're welcome to sit in the chair, but only if you have black hair. And so immediately, there are a group of people who are not going to be able to sit in this chair because they don't have black hair. And so the people who have black hair say, okay, I can sit in the chair. And then it says, no, but only if you have black hair and blue eyes and you wear braces. And so there are another set of people who will not be able to sit in this chair. The idea here that I'm trying to convey is that when we create technology and software and digital spaces that are not accessible, is that inherently we are creating this chair and we are telling a set of people from the jump that this chair is not for them, that they're not allowed to sit in it. And even though they need to sit in this chair, they need to be able to access the technology, we are creating that barrier for them. We are automatically saying that we are not creating this for you and that we do not want you to access this. And so it's really important that as we think about creating technology and software and digital spaces, that we remember that the idea here is that we want as many people as possible to be able to sit in that red chair. It's comfortable, it makes sense, it's what we all want to do. And so we all should have access to that chair. So who is affected when we think about creating a strategic accessibility program? We have persons with disabilities, and those include visual disabilities, auditory, physical, neurological, and cognitive. Something to think about is that disabilities can be permanent, they can be temporary, and they can be situational. And so what that means is that if we think of someone who is blind, we know that that is a permanent disability. If we think of someone who has an injury to their eye, a temporary injury to their eye, that in that case, that is a temporary disability because at some point their vision will return to what it previously was. And then if we think of situational, we can think of someone who is in a very dimly lit room. And so in that situation, they have low vision and they're not able to see as they would normally. And so that is a situational disability. The idea that I want to convey is that this means that really and truly anyone and everyone at some point in their life will have a disability. Maybe not permanent, maybe not even temporary, but we all go through situations where we have a specific disability. And so the idea here is that as we think about creating this program and making sure that the technology and the software and the content that we create is accessible, that we're really doing this because every single person, ourselves included, benefits from this. Accessibility is absolutely necessary for some people, but it is beneficial to every single one of us. And so we should keep that in mind as we go through this. So what is strategic accessibility? I'll start by saying it is not just compliance and testing. I know when we usually start working on accessibility, especially in corporate environments, especially smaller organizations, or when we're in the infancy stage of our programs, we really think about compliance and testing. How do we meet a set of standards? How do we check the box? How do we test against those standards? But really, strategic accessibility is a holistic approach to accessibility within an organization. It's really thinking about how do we think of accessibility as a practice and as a process, and not simply just a project that we are trying to start and finish. Accessibility has no beginning and end, really. It's an ongoing, continual process that we'll go through, especially when we engage with it as a practice. And strategic accessibility requires consistent process integration and change. It's something that's going to evolve over and over and over again over time as standards change, as software changes, as hardware changes, as we update features and products. It's something that we continually have to work on integrating into our existing processes. So this talk is named The 7 Pillars of Accessibility. And so we are going to spend some time talking about what those 7 pillars are. So I'll go through them one by one here, and then we'll talk in more detail about each one. We start with design and development. We have empathy, testing and validation, partnership, auditing and compliance, communication, and then education and training. So let's start with design and development. So when we think about designing and developing, whether it be a game, some type of technology, a website, video, we really have to think about infusing accessibility into the product development lifecycle. And this means that we have to think of accessibility by design. Since we're not just focused on compliance, we're not just focused on testing at the end to make sure we meet the standards, we really want to infuse accessibility into the entire process from the very beginning. And so inherently, we know that we are creating an accessible product because we've thought about it from the very beginning. We've scoped with accessibility requirements. We have designed with accessibility in mind. And so by the time we get to the end product, we already know that it's inherently accessible. And so the testing is almost a formality. We're doing it because we need to show that it's accessible, but we know that it's accessible because we've designed it that way. We need to create accessibility guidelines and guardrails. And so I like to describe guidelines as the guidelines guide us, the guardrails stop us. And so the guidelines tell us what we need to bear in mind, how we need to design or develop our software or game. And then the guardrails say, okay, if we don't pass this specific test, for example, if we look at something like flash rate testing, if we don't pass a flash rate test, then we won't release a game, for example. And so those guidelines guide us, and those guardrails help to stop us and know, hey, we can't pass this guardrail unless we pass a specific test. In this pillar, we also document best practices, so the things that we should do. So for example, if we have video content, we think of best practices as no more than 3 flashes per second. We think of color contrast, we think of audio descriptions. And so there are best practices around a specific type of content. And then design and development requires consistent process integration and change. So when we think of accessibility by design, which falls under the design and development pillar, we want to build into the entire product development lifecycle accessibility. So every team member inherently becomes a partner and an advocate. This means that the requirements will be met, but at the same time, we're creating an accessible user experience. So if we look at a very trimmed down version of the product development lifecycle, we think about concept and scoping. At this stage, we're going to have things like accessibility requirements. We're going to prioritize those requirements. At the user research stage, we're going to think about accessibility personas. We're going to make sure we're doing some user testing and research with members of the disabled community. We're going to design based on whatever guidelines we have for that specific piece of content. We're going to do design reviews to make sure that our design meet our accessibility requirements. And we're going to do even further user testing with members of the disabled community. In our development stage, we do things like we're going to utilize standard components. If it's a button, it's going to be coded as a button. If it's a link, it'll be coded as a link. We're going to make sure our alt text makes sense and that it conveys the right amount of information. We're going to make sure that our website, for example, allows for keyboard navigation, and we're going to make sure we use semantic HTML, which is inherently accessible. And then the last part of it is that if we look at QA, we're going to look at automated and manual testing. We're going to do things like harding tests, which is flash rate testing. And then we're going to make sure we test with a screen reader so that we can ensure that our website, for example, is screen reader compatible. So the next pillar is empathy. And this really speaks for itself. We are trying to build empathy within the organization. We want the members of our organization to really humanize the efforts that we're doing in order to make our products accessible. We want to encourage advocacy. We want to identify the people who are advocates for the disabled community. And then we want to establish communities of practice. This can be as simple as an accessibility club. Maybe you meet once a month, once a week. But the idea here is that we want to bring news and events that are happening in the community. We want to help them understand the specific challenges that anyone in the community may have. We want to bring in guests. So the idea here is really to humanize our efforts, really help to build empathy within the organization. The next pillar is testing and validation. And really, as it says, the idea here is that as we design and develop, we want to make sure that we're using user research and that we are testing throughout the process. We want to measure and validate against any organizational standards. As we know, there are legal standards that we consider when we talk about compliance. For testing and validation, we also want to think, are there standards that as an organization we have set when it comes to accessibility that may go beyond those legal standards? And so we want to make sure we're validating and measuring against those. We also work with the QA team here to make sure we're testing the development work. So things like screen reader testing would fall into this category. And then we want to do ongoing audits and regression testing. And the idea here is that as we update our products, whether it's a website, a game, some type of software, that we want to make sure the things that already existed are still passing in the way that we need them to, and are still meeting those standards. And then we want to get an accurate idea of where we are if we're just starting out. So that would be included in the audit here. So when we talked about doing user research and testing, something that's helpful in this process is an accessibility persona. So the idea here is that when we design with accessibility in mind, we want to think of who our users are. So we want to create personas that represent those users. Most often in user research or user experience, we do traditional personas, which focus on who that person is, maybe that they're a teacher or they're a gamer, versus a behavioral persona, which is more useful in accessibility because it talks about their ability, how they're going to interact with the technology, what we need to consider if they use assistive tech. And so it covers a wide range of abilities. And in most cases, when we're creating these personas, ideally we want to combine different abilities. So for example, we can have a user that, or persona, who has low vision, may also have a fine motor skill disability, and then may also have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And so the idea is that where possible, we want to combine different abilities. Where possible, we also want to use actual data. And then if we have a user, an example of a real life user, we want to model the persona after an actual disabled user where possible. Next, we'll talk about partnership. So we want to build relationships with the accessibility community. The work that we do is important because they're actual users who need us to create accessible tech and accessible experiences. And so we want to make sure we're not just creating something for this community without considering the community and without looping them in and allowing them to influence the products that we're creating. We want to build relationships with them. We want to partner with organizations that focus on accessibility. In any way possible, we want to give back to that community. And so that means allowing them to provide insight for us, allowing them to give feedback, allowing them to really direct and lead the direction of our product, influence that product. And then ultimately, we want to create a feedback channel. So whether that is through a customer support email or through a phone number, the idea is that we want to constantly keep that door open so that we can receive feedback from the accessibility community. Our next pillar is compliance and auditing. And so this is the one that I think most of us are familiar with. We know what the legal accessibility standards are, where most of us are familiar with WCAG, whether that's 2.0 or 2.1, CVAA, 508. There are a set of legal accessibility standards that we all comply with at some level. We also have organizational standards that we may have set, and I mentioned those earlier too. So here's where we would make sure that we're complying with those. And then for me, more importantly, we need to make sure we're documenting and reporting our compliance status. This needs to happen both internally and externally as best as we can with as much information as we can. The idea here is that, and the reason why I think this is really important is that as a disabled user, if I come to your website or if I want to buy your game, but I have no idea what standards you're meeting. If I'm able to use it with my specific assistive tech that I need, then I'm left at a disadvantage. We need to be as clear as we can and as honest and open as we can about where we stand with compliance and what our users are able to do with our technology. So we have communication, and really this is about making sure that we communicate out program status, both within and outside of the organization, communicating compliance status, and this happens both internally and externally, and then our approach to accessibility. When we think about how we're communicating out, it should never really be a surprise why accessibility is important to us. If I visit your company website or your program website, and I don't have a good understanding of the work that you're doing, why it's important to you, what's coming up next, what you've worked on so far, then we're not really communicating effectively and we're failing at this pillar. So the idea here is that there should be a clear line of communication between the company or program and the end user in terms of where you stand in accessibility, what your program entails, and what your compliance status is. For a lot of organizations, this can be done through a VPAT, which is a voluntary product accessibility template in which you convey your status voluntarily to anyone who wants to know. And in some cases, it's done through an accessibility page on a website or an accessibility statement. But the idea is that you should be clearly conveying to your end user or to the general public where you stand on accessibility and what work you're doing and what work is coming up. And the last pillar that we have here is education and training. And so this one is about building the knowledge for your organization. It's my belief that every single employee at a company, whether you interact directly with the software, whatever team you're on, should have a baseline knowledge of what accessibility means. What does it mean to be accessible? So we can do that through curriculum, we can do that through courses, but building up that internal knowledge of what accessibility is within your organization. We also want to build specialized knowledge with functional teams. So if you're working as a part of the design team, there's specific knowledge that you will need. For example, if you're on a video production team or video design team, you'll need to understand flash content. You'll need to understand color contrast. You'll need to understand how audio descriptions are going to integrate with your video. And so that specific knowledge is something that you'll need to do your job as part of that functional team. We need to establish best practices, again, with functional teams, and then standard operating procedures for any processes that we have. So if we have a specific process for doing flash rate testing, we need to make sure that there is an SOP for that process. If we have a specific process for creating video content, we need to make sure that there's an SOP for that also. The idea here is that we want to make sure that everyone who's involved in this process, who really is the entire company, because everyone is a part of the march toward accessibility, has a specific level of knowledge around what it means to create accessible products and how their specific roles engage with accessibility. So why does strategic accessibility work, and why do these 7 pillars work together? Really, what I think is that the 7 pillars allow you to be proactive versus reactive. When we think of just compliance and testing, it's really a reactive process. We're saying, these are the standards, and we're testing, and we're gonna fix the problem if we fail a test in order to be compliant. And what the 7 pillars or strategic accessibility forces you to do is to be proactive, to think ahead and to look forward and to really plan strategically about how we're gonna create accessibility and make sure our products are accessible. It creates for distributed ownership, and that's because everyone's involved. In the 7 pillars, we talked about design, development, QA, program managers, marketing, customer support or player support, and we can go on and on, but the idea here is that every single person has a part to play in the strategic program. And so the ownership lies with the entire organization. And so everyone plays a part in making sure that we're successful. It's not just the program manager who's really pushing it and owning it. Every single person plays a part in it. There's organizational buy-in at the highest level. Really, as the strategic accessibility program matures, we get buy-in from C-level executives. We get buy-in from the top coming down. We get to create company level OKRs. And so as an organization, we're marching towards a single goal of creating accessible products. And then the end user gets to influence the product and the outcome and the processes that we integrate into all of this. And so because we're continually going back to the disabled community and getting input and getting feedback and making sure they're involved and working through our empathy pillar to bring them in and have them speak to us and demo for us. And it's a tight-knit relationship and partnership that's happening. And so the end user gets to really influence what happens. And then we're continuously evaluating the state and maturity of each pillar or program. The idea here is that when we're starting a strategic accessibility program, we're infants, right? We're going to be doing things, we're going to be taking baby steps, we're going to be progressing to solid foods, for example. But the idea here is that as we grow and mature and get better and better at this, at the end of this, we're going to have an optimized program. We're going to have a program that we can recreate in different organizations, a really mature and developed program. And so strategic accessibility works because we're constantly evaluating the maturity and pushing it to the next level. And then the last thing here is that it appeals to every angle. And so when we talk about accessibility, often we talk about the ethical reasons why we need to do it. It's the right thing to do. It absolutely is. And we should all be doing it. But it also makes financial sense. And using a strategic accessibility program shows that. We know that if we do accessibility right from the beginning, that it costs us a lot less than if we wait till the end to try to retroactively fix it. We also know that when we talked about the numbers of disabled gamers, for example, we know that if we don't create accessible games, that we're missing out on an entire market of, millions of users who would do it. From a technical perspective, we know that if we don't create accessible products, that we have technical debt. And so it's the right thing to do on many levels. And so strategic accessibility really appeals to every angle: ethical, financial, technical, legal, user experience, anything that we can think of. It's the right way to approach accessibility within an organization. Even with a strategic accessibility program, we have to think about prioritizing accessibility. So the things that we often think about are impact versus cost versus effort. And so we may look at things like, what is the most popular feature or product? And that will probably have a high impact. We may look at, is there a common disability? So if we have a video that we know is viewed by a lot of users who are blind, for example, making sure that that video content has audio descriptions, has descriptive transcripts, has closed captions. We know that creates a high impact because a lot of users who are blind are going to watch our video or experience our video. And then, are there low-hanging fruits? Are there things that we can tackle very easily? That may be something that we can do. So maybe it costs us less and low effort, and we can do it. And then we have to look at the stage in the development cycle. So if we're tackling something in the very beginning, it's probably a lot less effort than if we're tackling it at the end when we're in development in QA. We have to look at the cost of doing it now versus doing it later. We know that with accessibility, as with other things, if we do it right now, in both ways, if we do it correctly, right, like now, and if we do it right now, versus doing it later, that the cost is much less, is a multiplier. So if we do it today and we do it correctly, we're going to pay X. If we try to not do it now and then try to do it later, we may pay 10X to get it done. And so really and truly, the cost of doing it now makes it worth doing it correctly today. And then setting hard cutoffs. At some point, we have to set a limit and say, we're not going to launch any more products, or we're not going to release any new features that are not accessible, that do not meet the set of standards. Because if we continue to let that slip, then again, the cost goes up for implementing accessibility. And then establishing gates and performing reviews throughout the entire process. So as I wrap up, we're going to think about the important reminders here. So the work of accessibility is never really done. It's truly a balancing act. So is it fun? Is it user-focused? Does it provide an equitable experience? And is it accessible? And then it's always evolving. So standards are always changing and getting better. New guidelines are always introduced. We have to think about user needs. Hardware, software is always changing. And so the idea here that I really want to convey is that accessibility really is never done. And so there's no checkbox that we're checking and saying, yes, it's accessible. No, it's not. It's always constantly evolving, and we should always be pushing to get to the next level of accessibility. And that is it. Questions?
Excellent. Thank you so much, Enid. That was wonderful and a lot of information. We've got some excellent questions that we've gotten through the chat. So if you guys have additional questions, please feel free to let me know. I don't want to stop the momentum on this, but I do want to say for those who are asking about the slides, those will be available on this particular session page after the presentation. So we will post them afterwards. So I apologize for that inconvenience. So the first question that I wanted to cover is there any strategy recommendations that you have for pushing a strategic accessibility program within an organization where nothing like it currently exists?
So if I were looking at that, so nothing exists, I'd have to consider whether or not we have any type of buy-in. So it's always easy to push something when you have an advocate or you have someone who understands why it's important. I've worked in organizations before where there was no program structure to begin with. And so what it really was somebody thinking, the work of accessibility is important. And so we're going to start with something little. We're going to try to get a quick, easy win. And what that does is really, it shows the people who need to be shown, our stakeholders, that we want to do the work, that there are ways to do the work that may not be as extensive as creating a whole program. So starting with something very small and kind of building up from there, really looking at what are your low-hanging fruits, what can you achieve really quickly and easily, creating a case for it. So there are a couple case studies out there that talk about making a case for accessibility, really maybe even documenting the strategy and sharing it. So making a case for accessibility really with the people who need it. But I would say, above all else, starting with a small win and really showing how we can get the ball rolling with it.
Yeah, excellent. Another great question that came in, what roadmap do you see for the future of gaming technology and accessibility? I'm sure you're thinking about this all the time.
What game? So I will say that I think a lot. So accessibility in gaming is not where it needs to be. I'll say that very freely. It's something we're aware of and something we're working on. What I want to see is what I talked about. So I think right now we are still being very reactive. We are still trying to catch up to the baseline because we're not there as yet. In the future, I want to see us really incorporate the user experience. So to move beyond the idea of meeting the standards, even infusing it into the process, like really getting to the point where we are proactively thinking about our users' needs and really thinking about how we can meet them.
Yeah, I'm sure that takes a lot of time, and also just user groups to figure out how they're utilizing the game and systems and whatnot. So
I'll add to that too. Sorry, I was going to say, I'll add to that too. In the gaming world, there's always this friction between fun and exciting and interactive and accessible. And so I think the future of accessibility in gaming is understanding that those two things are not separate and that they need to come together. And I think once we master that, we'll get to a better point with accessibility in the future.
Yeah, definitely. Another question, what are some resources for user testing in the disabled community?
I'm going to add those to my slides so when we upload. There are a couple of organizations that really focus. I know there's one in Austin, I cannot remember the name at the moment, but there are a couple of organizations where you can reach out and say, hey, this is the product I'm testing. They will work with you to identify the types of users that you need. So different types of abilities, combinations of abilities, and kind of work based on the product that you're testing to kind of see what your needs are. And then as an extension, work to facilitate those user testing sessions if you don't have an in-house user research or user testing department that has easy access to disabled users. At past organizations, I've also worked with, local school for blind students, local schools for deaf and or blind students, working with, if we're looking at special ed, local high schools, local schools, any organization. So if we look in our specific areas, there are organizations that are specifically for disabled users. And so partnering with them to make sure that we get the user testing done is also a really good way to go about it.
Yeah. Someone mentioned maybe nobility in Austin. Is that what you were talking about?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Excellent. Yes. But she said this would be included in the slideshow, so we'll have that information for you guys. Okay, I'm just going to keep rolling, Enid. So,
Sure.
how do you implement these pillars successfully when your organization is split up into smaller teams, for example, like per project? And how do you ensure consistency when you do that?
So I think the guidelines and the guardrails really help with that. I can speak to the organizations that I've worked with and currently work for, very large organizations. So I guess large is relative, but large organizations that have various product teams, even various pillars in the sense of like, we may have a video or content pillar, we may have a game pillar, we may have some other pillar. So, and the idea is that across all these pillars, we want to have the same standard operating procedures. And that's where kind of the guidelines and the guardrails come into play. We want to make sure we have those well-defined. And so it doesn't matter if you're working on this game or if you're working on this video, when you're producing certain content, these are the operating procedures. These are the guidelines that you need to follow. These are the guardrails that you need to get through before you can move on to the next step. For example, I've worked in an organization where we have guardrails at every stage of the product development lifecycle. So before you move from stage 1 to stage 2, there has to be a conversation about what the accessibility standards are, what our organizational accessibility guidelines are before you move forward. At stage 4, there's another conversation around, okay, we've already talked about the standards. How are you going to make sure you're meeting those standards? At stage 6, which may be at this point, a beta version, we need to actually do some testing. So we're actually doing a screen reader testing, or we're actually doing flash rate testing to make sure. And so making sure that those guardrails are in place, regardless of the silos that exist, will really help with that. So doing it kind of from a functional perspective, as opposed to a product perspective.
And probably communicating those guardrails and guidelines across the board too. They're all hand in hand, huh?
Yes. Yes.
So the next question is, I'm a dyslexic gamer. Do you see games with built-in assistive technology becoming an industry standard, or including even more assistive technology, for example, like text-to-speech or something like that?
Absolutely. I will say that part of the CGA guidelines, which is the Communications Video Accessibility Act, is that we do text-to-speech and speech-to-text. And so that is something that we are, as an industry, working to make sure we get done.
Okay. I think this next question kind of goes back to the other one, but it has a little bit of a different flavor. So I want to make sure that we address it. So do you have advice on getting engagement and participation in accessibility across all departments in a company or an agency? So how do you kind of garner that interest and engagement?
Okay. So I think this speaks to the empathy piece of it a little bit. What I find has worked well is that when we kind of humanize the efforts, so when we kind of put a face to the work that we're doing, that really tends to pique the interest of some people. The other thing that has worked really well is kind of identifying your partners within each team. So if you are a program manager, let's say, for example, with accessibility, or you're doing some work in accessibility, you want to make sure you can identify, is there a developer who may be interested in accessibility, who you can kind of get to be your voice or your advocate within the development team? Is there a designer who maybe they have some interest in accessibility? And so kind of identifying your key advocates within each functional team really helps, because you're not going to be everywhere all the time, and you're not going to be able to convince every single person that we need to do this work. But if you can identify, because you as a program manager may not speak, dev speak is what I like to call it, really well. And so you're engaging with developers from a program manager perspective. But if you have that developer who's your advocate, they're going to engage with the development team speaking dev speak. So instead of saying, hey guys, this is what we need to do, they're going to say, hey guys, this is how we do it. So it's not really that hard. This is actually what we need to code. And this is how we implement, this thing. And so it kind of creates that, or I guess reduces that barrier to actually getting the work done. So I find that really identifying key partners within different functional teams has helped me in the past, where there's a little, pushback in terms of how do we actually get this work done, or getting them engaged and interested in doing the work.
Yeah, definitely to find a friend can always be helpful. So
absolutely.
Excellent.
And especially the nature of accessibility work often is that we start as teams of one or maybe two. And so when you think about the fact that you are only one person working in an organization that may be, I've worked in organizations that are 3,000 people and I am one accessibility hire. And so there's literally no way that I can do all the work and I can create all the impact and I can even reach everybody. And so you literally have to partner with your advocates in the organization until you're able to build that team and build that momentum.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. So talking about kind of building the case, one of the questions we have is, how do you convince upper management that accessibility is the law and to get on board with compliance?
I would say show them all the lawsuits, but that's the I guess the sarcastic answer. But the idea really is like, there is a cost to accessibility. There's a cost to not being compliant. There's a cost to not being accessible. And we've seen it increase in the last couple of years, especially. The lawsuits are coming out the woodwork. We shouldn't need them to encourage us to do what needs to be done. But there's definitely a case for why we need to do this work, because there are legal ramifications to it. Outside of, if you're a federal or federally funded organization, like, you should be doing it either way. But beyond that, even as a private institution or private organization, you can be sued, you can get into legal trouble for it. The other thing I'll do is we'll talk about the financial cost. So we know that accessibility is going to cost us upfront to become compliant or to establish a program, but the cost in 5 years is going to be 10 times what's going to be today. And so what I found is that when you really lay out the facts that way and say, hey, pull up the case studies and say, hey, this is what it'll cost if we, supply 2,000 dev hours and 1,000 design hours, and we do this now, as opposed to continuing to create products that are not accessible. And then in 5 years, not only do we have to do the work to make the things we're currently creating accessible, but we have to go back and retroactively make everything the cost is astronomical. And so to me, when you bring it down to numbers in that way, that tends to work. The other thing we talked about is that the user base, the numbers, like 33 million gamers in the US have disabilities, and 92% of them want to use games. Like, you're missing out, it shouldn't be about the money, but you're missing out on the money. Like, these are millions of users who we're not tapping into because they literally cannot play our games. They cannot use our products. We talked about the numbers of special ed, 15% of school-age children. And so if you're making ed tech, you want to make sure those students can use your product. And so from a financial perspective, which I think often tends to work with upper level management, they tend to see the numbers when we talk about it some more, but yes. And then so legally, nobody wants to get sued. And also from a financial perspective, the numbers show that it makes sense to tackle accessibility. Yeah. It's not going anywhere, and it's only becoming more and more important. And yeah, so we've seen it over the last 10 years, nobody was talking about it, and now everybody's talking about it, and I don't think it's going anywhere. So.
Right. Yeah. So keeping along that, I know you shifted from like the legal ramifications to cost. How have you quantified the cost savings of doing accessibility work early, so that whole like shift left mentality in the SDLC versus waiting until something's already in production and trying to remediate?
Depending on the scope of the project, it's millions, literally. We've done risk analysis, we've done in different organizations, and we've seen the literally millions of dollars to do the work now, both from a perspective of doing it now versus doing it later, and then from a risk perspective in terms of getting sued and the cost of potential liability if somebody gets a seizure. There are costs associated with that. And when we really look at the numbers, I don't want to give specifics, but I mean, there are millions on the at risk.
There's a lot of good data sources out there too. I
Yes.
think, IBM has put together some, cost of fixing defects, earlier in the life cycle versus
Yes.
later. And then there's also some ROI things on accessibility. So,
Correct.
yeah. Yep.
I think Microsoft has a really good one in the ROI also. Yes.
They do. Yep. So the next one is really around data and metrics. So in a past life, I used to have somebody who always made data-driven decisions at our previous organization. And I know that how important that can be in also this business case, right? So can you describe some of the metrics your team and company uses to measure accessibility improvements and how you actually do those measurements?
So a lot of it goes around user research and user testing. So we look at, and it's both qualitative and quantitative in some ways. So we look at the experience the user has achieving specific goals. We look at the equity of the experience. So a user that doesn't need specific accessibility services, how are they accessing, how are they using the product versus a user that needs specific accessibility services? How are they able to do it? We literally look at numbers. So our support channel, customer support, player support channel documents the tickets that we get in that are specific to accessibility. We have a specific channel for that. And so we look at when we make a fix, does that affect how many reports we get and how many issues are reported as we're making a fix? So we look at, okay, this specific issue is being reported 10 times a week. That means it gets prioritized higher, and then we fix it and we look at what that translates into in terms of the tickets that we have coming in. Trying to think anything else off the top of my head. Yeah.
Okay. That's great though. Just, getting acclimated with what should you be tracking and,
Yes.
how that has an impact and everything is great.
Even looking at things like, sorry.
No, go for it.
I was going to say, even looking at things like the user experience, like how many clicks does it take a user to get to a specific target in both situations, just to make sure there's equity in the experience.
Yep, that's awesome. So we're running low on time. We might have time for maybe 2 questions, maybe just one. Any additional tips about how to build specialized knowledge within functional teams?
I say really partner with those teams. Your functional team is already an expert at what they do. Your design team knows very well how to design something. And so what they don't need you to come in and say, hey, here are all these things you now need to do. It really works best when it's a partnership and you kind of sit together and figure out what makes sense. You know the standards very well. That's what you're good at. They know designing really well. That's what they're good at. And how do those 2 things come together to really, so to me, creating best practices and guidelines and guardrails should be a joint effort between your functional team and your accessibility SME or program manager, and really working to understand how those 2 things integrate together.
Awesome. Well, I just want to thank Enid so much for your time. This has been an excellent presentation. We got a lot of great Q&A in. So thank you all so much. And thank everyone for attending, and enjoy the rest of AxeCon. Take care, guys.
Thank you.